SLT Mobitel Fiber, the fiber of the nation. SLT Mobitel Fiber, the fiber of the nation.
Comfort Moodian Bagiai Kalak Pavatina Alut Penuai.
Tonight, another step forward. A new set of health guidelines issued with O-level and A-level tuition classes given the go-ahead at 50% capacity.
The health sector was delaying the recommendation to restart the schools until a sizable population of the country is vaccinated, especially the elderly.
A local warning. State Minister Professor Channa Jayasumane heralds a new danger of an old COVID variant evading vaccine protection. A global concern. President Gotabaya sets off for the UN Climate Change Conference. All that and much more coming up on First at 9. This Saturday, the 30th of October, 2021.
Nelly, Mataken, Gilihunu Black Shiny, Kes Kalamaka Rasa, Sunset, Black Shine Samagin.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening, welcome to First at 9. I'm Dhamike Kanai. Now then, schools for grades 10, 11, 12 and 13 will resume from the 8th of next month, ending a months-long gap induced by the pandemic. Issuing new health guidelines, the Director General of Health Services also granted permission to resume tuition classes for GC ordinary level and advanced level students from the 16th of next month. However, with a student capacity not exceeding 50%.
As per the recommendations by the Special Committee on COVID-19, schools will resume for students of grades 10, 11, 12 and 13 from the 8th of next month. In line with the decision, Catholic schools in the country too will be reopened for these grades. Following a 6-month closure brought on by the pandemic, Sri Lanka also fully reopened primary schools island-wide starting from the 25th. Meanwhile, signed by the Director General of Health Services, new guidelines have been issued for the period extending from the 1st to the 15th of November, while continuing some of the previous guidelines issued. As per the new guidelines, people are instructed to avoid unnecessary travel in order to minimize the risk of transmission. As for meetings and events, health authorities strongly encourage virtual platforms. However, for in-person meetings, only a maximum of 1/3 of the usual capacity of the room or hall is allowed, not exceeding 150 persons. In terms of private gatherings, a maximum of 1/3 of the capacity, not exceeding 10 persons, are allowed at a private residence. Economic centres continue to be open for wholesale business, however under strict supervision of local authorities and the area MOH. Guidelines with regard to restaurants continue to remain the same, with an in-house capacity of 75 persons allowed. As for outdoor arrangements, authorities have granted permission for a crowd of 100 people. Daycares are permitted to continue operations, and for preschools, only 50% of the usual capacity is allowed. For vocational training institutes, half of its usual capacity is allowed. As for cinema theatres, permission has been granted for only 25% of the full capacity. In an event of a wedding, a maximum of 1/3 of the usual capacity of the hall is allowed, not exceeding 100 people. In terms of outdoor weddings, the guidelines allow a maximum crowd of 150 people. In an event of a funeral, a maximum of 20 attendees are given permission at a given time. Collective activities or gatherings are strictly prohibited at religious places. Meanwhile, among the more notable revisions, permission has been granted to resume tuition classes for GCE ordinary level and advanced level students from the 16th of next month. However, the establishments can only accommodate 50% of student capacity. According to the communique, the health authorities will review the pandemic situation and issue the relevant guidelines to be followed after the 15th of November. In the meantime, the ongoing interprovincial travel restrictions will be lifted tomorrow at 4 a.m. With that, interprovincial trains will resume normal operations starting from the 1st of November.
Big 3.
Now then, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa left the island today to attend the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties in the UK. During the conference, leaders, academics and representatives of 197 countries will work together to develop strategies in order to tackle the current climate crisis across 13 days.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa left the island today in order to attend the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties in the United Kingdom. The conference will take place in Glasgow, Scotland and will kick off tomorrow. It will be worked off across 13 days until the 12th of November. During the conference, the world leaders will focus on the strategies that could be implemented by each country to tackle the climate crisis. Accompanying the President is Minister of Environment Mahinda Amaraveera, State Minister of Solar, Wind and Hydropower Generation Projects, Development Duminda Disanayaka, Principal Advisor to the President Lalit Veeratunga, Foreign Secretary Admiral Professor Jainath Kolombage and Secretary to the Ministry of Environment Dr. Anil Jasinger. The leaders of 197 countries, representatives and academics are taking part in the event. They will focus on achieving the goals such as securing global net zero emissions by mid-century. The focus will also fall on keeping climate change within 1.5 degrees Celsius without letting it hit 2 degrees. Adapting to protect communities and natural habitats, mobilizing necessary finances, and working together to ensure that the Paris rulebook is finalized will also be looked at.
Now, there were alarm bells today over a COVID-19 variant which threatens to slip through the protection offered by vaccines. State Minister of Production, Supply and Regulation of Pharmaceuticals, Professor Channa Jayasumana, said that the variant A30 is an old variant and that studies have found it evades COVID-19 vaccines protection, especially that of Pfizer and AstraZeneca.
Reaping the benefits of a sequence of control measures, including an island-wide quarantine curfew imposed by the government, Sri Lanka has managed to maintain control over its pandemic situation, keeping the daily case numbers way below the 1,000 mark. The country also saw the lowest number of COVID-related deaths occurred on the 28th of this month since May this year, and the number stood at 10. However, with renewed outbreaks witnessed in Europe, especially in UK, Israel and Singapore, the Sri Lankan Medical Association moved to caution the country over another possible wave. With the lifting of some movement restrictions, the SLMA observes that implementation of the guidelines and regulations on public health measures issued by the ministry are extremely lax, adding that they are widely disobeyed by the public. Fearing that this would compromise the hard-earned control over the pandemic, the association urged the government to strictly enforce the current regulations as the resurgence of another wave in the country is imminent. With 61.2% of the country's total population having fully vaccinated, what would another wave mean for Sri Lanka?
UK and certain countries like Israel, there had been good rate of vaccination and they were hopeful that this will stop the population getting COVID again. But if you look at UK, there are about 50,000 cases per day. But the difference between the earlier waves and this wave, that they get the illness, but the number of deaths is extremely low. So we are hopeful that even if we get another wave, there will be less deaths, less admissions to the hospitals, and there will be less demand for oxygen.
With primary schools resumed and plans afoot to resume some selected grades, the threat of school children contributing to another surge too remains a higher possibility. However, Dr. Disanayaka is of the view that the schools reopening in the current vaccination environment is no issue.
When you consider the school reopening, yes, the children can get COVID, but after the age of 2, COVID is not a scary illness in children. The danger is for the children to get it from the friends and they take it home, and the grandfathers and grandmothers would get infected. But fortunately, the grandfathers and grandmothers in this country are vaccinated. And we are hopeful that even if they get it, that will be a mild illness. The health sector was delaying the recommendation to restart the schools until a sizable population of the country is vaccinated, and especially the elderly and people with other illnesses are vaccinated. When the schools restart, even if the children get it and they take it home, the elderly will not succumb to the illness. And even if there's a fourth wave, we'll hope that the fourth wave will be much less dangerous and there will be less deaths compared to the third.
The likes of UK too reopened schools in March, much earlier than Sri Lanka, however only after vaccinating most of the vulnerable segments in the country. Speaking at the weekly media briefing, Chief of the World Health Organization Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus attributed the rise in cases to the inequitable access to tools.
The global number of reported cases and deaths from COVID-19 is now increasing for the first time in 2 months, driven by an ongoing rise in Europe that outweighs declines in other regions. It's another reminder that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over. The pandemic persists in large part because inequitable access to tools persists. 80 times more tests and 30 times more vaccines have been administered in high-income countries than low-income countries. Unless the pandemic is controlled everywhere, the virus will mutate and continue to circulate everywhere. All countries, including high-income countries, are at continued high risk of being exposed to new variants, infecting those who are fully vaccinated, risking the effectiveness of the tools we have, and risking the introduction of more stringent public health measures. Vaccines alone will not end the pandemic. We need all tools, vaccines, tests, treatments, PPE and public health measures to fight COVID-19 and save lives and livelihoods now.
Meanwhile, also speaking at the same media briefing, Chief Scientist at the WHO, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, stressed that selective vaccination status should not be a barrier for international travel.
The emergency committee that reviews the international health regulations meet every 3 months or so to review the status of the pandemic and have again reiterated, they have underlined their previous recommendations that countries should not use vaccination status or selective vaccination status as a sole criteria for entry for travel. You could use a vaccination status but also a negative test prior to entry or proof of a previous test, and many countries accept one or the other. And therefore, vaccination status should not be a barrier to global travel because that is just actually increasing the inequities around the world. There are large parts of the world where people do not have access to vaccines or who have received a vaccine that's not yet approved by all countries. And that should not be the criterion whether that individual can travel to other, because there are other ways of minimizing the risks of transmission.
Meanwhile, as per the district epidemiologist in Anuradhapura, an increase in daily cases had been experienced in the district during the past week. He says that the past week has seen over 600 patients in the Anuradhapura district. In the meantime, concerns are being raised over A30, an older COVID-19 variant, which is said to have capabilities of evading COVID vaccines, especially Pfizer and AstraZeneca. According to foreign media reports, the variant was last seen in May and June this year.
මේක මීට මාස කිහිපයකට ඉස්සෙල්ලා ලෝකෙන් වාර්තා වෙච්ච දෙයක්. හැබැයි අලුත් සොයා ගැනීමක් කරලා තියෙනවා. Pfizer, AstraZeneca ඇතුළු ප්‍රධාන පෙළේ එන්නත් සියල්ලකින්ම ඇති කරන ආරක්ෂාව මේ අගුල කඩන්න පුළුවන් කියලා මේ A30 කියන ප්‍රභේදයට. ඉතින් ඒ පිළිබඳව විශේෂයෙන්ම යුරෝපීය සහ ඇමරිකානු රටවල් වල අවධානයක් යොමු කරලා තියෙනවා. මොකද උන්ගේ ශීත ඍතුවේ මේ A30 කියන ප්‍රභේදය පැතිරුණොත් ලොකු අමාරුවකට යයි කියලා දැනටමත් ඔවුන් අනායෝගී පළ කරලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ ගැන අපිත් අවධානයෙන් ඉන්නේ. දැන් කොවිඩ් සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම අමතක කරලා වැඩේ හමාරයි කියලා හිතාගෙන වැඩ කරන්න ගියොත් නම් තව සති 4කින් විතර අපිට ආයි මේකේ ප්‍රතිඵල භුක්ති විඳින්න සිද්ධ වෙනවා.
However, the A30 variant is not mentioned under the WHO classification of the variants. It's not under the variants of concern, variants of interest, or variants that are being monitored at present.
Now in other local stories, Foreign Minister Professor G.L. Pires had met the UK's Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs, Elizabeth Truss, last Tuesday at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The minister had informed the UK Foreign Secretary that having fully vaccinated about 82% of the eligible population, life is getting back to normalcy in Sri Lanka. He had added that the British influence is visible in every aspect of Sri Lanka's life, be it politics, trade, finance, legal and education, and the names of major Sri Lankan companies indicate their origins and have been put up by British businessmen. Referring to the free trade agreements Sri Lanka have signed with India and Pakistan, he had stated that such agreements provide an opportunity to British companies and act as a conduit to manufacture in Sri Lanka for export to these markets. The UK Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs was also informed that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has encouraged the Foreign Minister to engage in dialogue with the diaspora and that the government is also reaching out to the Tamil National Alliance. Further, the government has also commenced an engagement with the civil society organisations, has released some suspects held under the provision of the Prevention of the Terrorism Act, and is revisiting the PTA to make changes which are not cosmetic but substantial. UK Foreign Secretary Elizabeth Truss, meanwhile, had reciprocated the sentiments expressed by the Sri Lanka Foreign Minister and stated that the two countries need to exchange more on investments. She had noted that the UK is developing a broader investment portfolio which Sri Lanka could be a part of. We will see you shortly after this break. Stay with us.
මිලියන 18.8 නිවස ලක්ෂ 5ක් ගෙවා දැන්ම වෙන් කරවා ගන්න මල්බෙරි රෙසිඩන්ස්.
Welcome back. You're watching First at 9. Now, permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in New York, Mohan Peiris, highlights that responsibility and immunity are logically incompatible. His comments came during the 6th committee meeting of the 76th UN General Assembly session that focused on the report of the International Law Commission on the work of its 72nd session. He pointed out that even though state agents can be held responsible for crimes committed in an official capacity, they can remain immune against prosecution from international law.
It would appear that, as the International Court of Justice explained, immunity is one thing and responsibility another. The arrest warrant of the 11th of April 2000 in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo versus Belgium clearly brought out the rationale that immunity from criminal jurisdiction and individual criminal responsibility are two different concepts. It went on to say that jurisdictional immunity is procedural in nature and criminal responsibility is a question of substantive law. The resultant position is that this separation of procedure from substance permits us to accept the position that state agents are now responsible for international crimes committed in an official capacity, although they may remain immune from prosecution in foreign courts. It would appear that international law cannot criminalize and immunize official acts at the same time. If official acts are immune from prosecution, then international law does not assign a sanction for such acts. And if there is no sanction attached, then there is no crime and no responsibility. It would appear that any waiver of procedural immunity establishes criminality of the act and the responsibility of the actor. It may be observed that the ILC, in its publication of the draft codes of crime against peace and security of mankind in 1996, went on to observe, quote, the absence of any procedural immunity with respect to prosecution and punishment in appropriate judicial proceedings is an essential corollary of the absence of any substantive immunity or defense. It would be paradoxical to prevent an individual of invoking his official position to avoid responsibility for a crime only to permit him to invoke the same consideration to avoid the consequences of his responsibility. It has also been observed that immunity and impunity are not the same and should therefore not be conflated. It must be appreciated that we are now in a position to consider the strength in the argument that responsibility and immunity are logically incompatible. It must be borne in mind that sanctions may be legally authorized but difficult to impose. A variety of legal obstacles to lawful punishment may arise in the course of a criminal prosecution without addressing the underlying act of criminality for a multitude of reasons. It is also widely accepted that high government officials enjoy personal immunity from criminal jurisdiction, including international crimes. It is a fact that the practical effect of immunity from arrest and other coercive measures will be such that high officials will never appear before foreign courts who are empowered to impose individual criminal liability. It would therefore, on a cursory consideration of the legal position, appear that it is open to debate that substantive criminal responsibility and procedural immunity are logically independent. The debate appears to have no end in sight and it is believed will go on for some time.
We will see you shortly. Bear with us. Welcome back. This is First at 9. Now then, experts say that traditional players in the financial sector are currently lagging behind emerging financial companies entering the sector armed with fintech. Views were expressed at a recent webinar that frameworks need to be put in place for traditional financial institutions to adopt open and digital banking systems.
If you specifically look at open banking and the related data collaboration that are coming from market forces can be seen in the US, Canada, Korea, Singapore, Malaysia. Whatever the model, the digital transformation is looking at exchanging financial data and identity data, and as well as actions like pay this amount to this payee, or the data about your accounts transaction. So when it comes to traditional players, big banks, the incumbent players, they have built their IT infrastructure by themselves. They have to maintain their own data centers. Their operational cost is very high. They have to live with their legacy systems. They have challenges in transforming their existing systems to match the agility required by the current market forces. But when it comes to the fintechs and new entrants to the system, they come with the latest technologies, the cloud native technologies. So they have an edge against the traditional players. But on the other side, the traditional players have built their trust with the customer for many years, but the neobanks don't have that trust. So for traditional players, they need to invest on that trust, and as well as the data that they have gathered doing transactions for many years. They are sitting on a treasure trove. So you can look at the patterns, you can look at the data that you have gathered, you can transform that data into information and then into wisdom. That are the benefits that they have. In most of the banks, they have taken fintechs or acquired fintechs to provide that digital transformation base. And on the other side, if you look at the customers, especially like Generation Z and the millennials, they are looking at real-time experience, the liveliness. They want real-time information, real-time payment, ability to, customize their payments, split payments. If they want to get a loan, they would like to get loan line in one day. Like a loan origination processes should be very fast. That's the liveliness that they're looking for, and they're driving the markets to move into that augmented user experience.
During the webinar, the question of what frameworks and key ingredients are needed for the adoption of digital and open banking systems was also raised.
Establishing a digital identity governance layer where we can have one digital identity not only within the financial sector across multiple domains, and bind the privacy and security aspect into that identity governance. And if you look at open banking is a digital transformation in disguise. We should come up with an open banking framework. It can extend from financial domain to other systems like the consumer data rights in Australia. That framework pushes the financial ecosystem players to adopt these new digital capabilities, expose their data, construct their data, and exchange this data in an open ecosystem. That is one of the key ingredients where we push a framework to build the digital capabilities. The other key ingredient is making the regulator itself capable of working with these digital ecosystems. As a government, we can establish an ecosystem where the government encourages fintech, the other private tech companies, the government institutions to play in this ecosystem and encourage innovation and invention in the system.
Now, the Monetary Board of the Central Bank has established an advisory committee to examine possible revival options for failed finance companies. The committee comprises 4 experts from the business sector and is chaired by the chairman of the CBC Finance Limited, former chairman of Commercial Bank of Ceylon PLC, and former deputy governor of the Central Bank, Derana English. The Monetary Board has vested the committee with the responsibility of recommending possible revival options for the 5 failed finance companies, of which the licenses have been either suspended or cancelled as at date. The 5 entities are the Central Investment and Finance Limited, ETI Finance Limited, TKS Finance Limited, the Finance Company PLC, and the Standard Credit Finance Limited. The Central Bank says that if reviving a particular entity does not seem feasible, the committee may recommend liquidation of the said entity. And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.